Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the Korea Economic Institute of America. I'm Kyle Ferrier, the Director of Academic Affairs and Research here at KEI. Before we get started, I just want to note that this program today is the first in our academic paper series of the year. In the fall, we sent out a call for papers and we received many great applications. But the programs and the papers that we have decided to pursue this year represent some of the best in a very competitive field, which speaks to the presentation which you're about to hear shortly. And turning to the topic at hand, the lack of an agreement between the United States and North Korea in Hanoi has raised a number of questions about the future of diplomacy with North Korea. But one thing that we walk away from Hanoi with is the certainty that the balance between denuclearization and sanctions relief is going to be at the crux of how we solve the talks with North Korea moving forward. So we're really lucky to have here with us today Dan Wirtz to talk about this. Dan is the program director at the National Committee on North Korea. And he's going to talk with us about his research that he wrote for us. His paper is available in hard copy outside as well as online on how the U.S. can best leverage its power, utilize its leverage from sanctions on North Korea to sort of beget denuclearization in North Korea and sort of the diplomatic approach to how the U.S. should do this. And we're not only lucky to have Dan with us on such an important topic, but the timing has worked out really well with Moon Jae-in's summit with Donald Trump tomorrow. And it's largely expected that Moon will talk about some of these issues. So hopefully this serves to color some of that commentary tomorrow between Trump and Moon. After Dan gives his presentation, we're also fortunate to have with us Bill Brown to serve as a discussant today. Bill served in the U.S. government for a number of years, looking at the North Korean economy, and he's currently an adjunct professor at Georgetown, a non-resident fellow here at KEI, and the principal of the Northeast Asia Economics and Intelligence Advisory. So I'll turn things over to Dan now to get us started.
Well, thanks, Kyle, for the introduction, and thanks to Bill Brown for serving as a discussant today, and to KEI for hosting me. It's great to be here and to start off the academic paper series. So it's been over a month now since the Hanoi summit ended with a fizzle. There are competing narratives about why exactly talks came to an abrupt end, but it's clear from the outcome of the summit that the issue of sanctions relief and the scope, timing, and pace of relief will be a really crucial issue if negotiations are to move forward. The U.S., before and after the summit, has said that sanctions will only be lifted after North Korea is denuclearized, although in the weeks before the summit, according to some public statements by U.S. officials, including Secretary Pompeo, there seemed to be a little bit of leeway in that stance. North Korea, of course, has vehemently rejected that kind of denuclearization approach in its own peculiar way, and has called for step-by-step sanctions relief and denuclearization, and for corresponding measures from the U.S. In return for its steps on its nuclear program. At Hanoi, according to North Korean Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho, the offer on hand was that North Korea would dismantle part or possibly all of the Yongbyon nuclear facility in return for the removal of the 5 latest UN sanctions resolutions. These are the resolutions that have by far the greatest impact on the North Korean economy, affecting many of North Korea's commercial exports, imports, as well as its banking and other issues. So, quite a difference between the two sides, big gap to bridge. I think despite the fact that sanctions relief was a major North Korean ask at the summit, though, I don't think sanctions alone were what caused Kim Jong-un's turn to diplomacy. about a year ago. The North Korean economy, as far as we can tell, is not quite in a crisis yet. The exchange rate appears to be stable. Food prices, despite reports of a bad harvest last fall, also seem to be fairly stable. Fuel prices jumped up the last couple of years, but have seemed to plateaued. And North Korean reported commercial imports from China, for the most part, have stayed fairly steady. However, sanctions are clearly standing in the way of Kim Jong-un's stated goal of economic development. And if sanctions continue to be implemented and enforced over a sustained period, they might very well induce a crisis in the North Korean economy. Sanctions are therefore an important source of potential U.S. leverage in negotiations, but given the North Korean regime's capacity to withstand pain, or at least to deflect the pain to its population, it's unrealistic to think that even a major economic crisis in North Korea could lead to total capitulation on its nuclear program. Instead, I would argue, a more effective approach might be one that forces Pyongyang to make difficult choices about trading away parts of its nuclear program for partial sanctions relief. Incremental sanctions relief could perhaps reduce the immediate nuclear threat posed by North Korea, and over the medium to long term could help reshape the North Korean regime's strategic calculus. At a minimum, U.S. willingness to offer partial sanctions relief in exchange for North Korean nuclear concessions could potentially weaken North Korean attempts to blame the U.S. if talks fail, and thereby help to keep the international coalition imposing sanctions more intact than it otherwise would be, as well as helping to keep the U.S.-ROK relationship on more of an even keel. So in this talk, I'm going to look at some of the strategic logic and challenges behind using sanctions as a tool of coercive bargaining and negotiating over the relief of sanctions. And I'll then develop a framework for how sanctions relief could proceed if negotiations with North Korea move forward. So a couple of metaphors first. It's frequently said that sanctions are just one tool in the U.S. policy toolbox and are not effective as a strategy in and of themselves, but need to be used in conjunction with other tools such as inducements, deterrence, diplomacy, etc. This is certainly true, and I think it's important to keep in mind. I'd also take this metaphor a little further by borrowing an analogy that Bill Brown has used before, that sanctions ideally should be something like a wrench, capable of being tightened or loosened and otherwise adjusted as demands of the situation might dictate, and not a one-way ratchet where sanctions are capable of being tightened but not loosened. I'd also use the metaphor, the analogy of sanctions as a lever or perhaps a crowbar, and make the point that if you've got a nearly immovable object, as you might compare North Korea's nuclear program for, maximum pressure alone will not necessarily move it unless that pressure is applied in a strategic way, and perhaps if pressure is applied in the right way, if it's applied and then released, and if need be applied again, can be used to move that once immovable object inch by inch. So in most sanctions regimes, there are three general objectives, and I think this certainly applies to North Korea: signaling, constraining, and coercing. In the case of North Korea, sanctions send a punitive signal to Pyongyang and other would-be proliferators that North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs are illegitimate in the eyes of the international community, and that further provocations will be met with further punishment. Second, sanctions are meant to constrain North Korea's development of weapons of mass destruction and its military capabilities. And third, and I think most importantly in how I think people typically think about sanctions, Sanctions are imposed as a form of coercive bargaining intended to compel Pyongyang to abandon its WMD programs in exchange for relief from economic pressure. So, most sanctions analysis has focused on the coercive half of the coercive bargaining equation, how to design effective sanctions, how to target them, etc., rather than on the bargaining half. But I'd argue that both halves of this equation are very important, and effectively trading sanctions relief or the promise of sanctions relief for concessions from the target of sanctions, it's also really important to think about how to do that right. So, to succeed in compelling an adversary, a strategy of sanctions has to fulfill two difficult but distinct tasks. First, economic pressure has got to be commensurate with the political importance of the policy that sanctions seek to reverse. In many cases, those policies are strongly held. That would certainly be the case for North Korea and its nuclear program. And even if sanctions put in place such overwhelming pressure, an adversary targeted by sanctions, while under duress, must come to believe that complying with the sanctioner's demands, either in part or in full, will leave them better off than the alternatives, or trying to adapt to life under sanctions, or possibly by escalating the underlying conflict in response to sanctions. So in order to be successful, sanctions need to be imposed as part of a comprehensive diplomatic strategy. There need to be realistic and clearly articulated goals behind them, and sanctions have to work in conjunction with other tools of diplomacy and policy to reshape the target's calculus in different ways. So just bargaining over compliance with sanctions poses some fundamental challenges. First, the state sending sanctions worries about the target's potential for cheating or for recidivism after sanctions are lifted, and about the difficulty of reasserting economic pressure after it's been relaxed. The target, in turn, runs the risk that compliance with demands of the sanctioning state will not result in promised relief, or that sanctions, for a variety of reasons, might be reimposed in the future. Simply getting to the table to negotiate over sanctions removal can be difficult. Both sides, the sanctioner and the sanctioned, will want to show resolve, will want to show toughness, and will be tempted to articulate maximalist demands and not to show a willingness to compromise. So partial sanctions relief can therefore have some value in building confidence in the negotiating process, in realizing intermediate objectives for both sides, and in building momentum for further action. But getting incremental or partial sanctions relief can also be very challenging. If sanctions are released too quickly, it runs the risk that the sanctions regime as a whole will erode, and the country being sanctioned can simply stonewall and wait out the rest of sanctions. If sanctions relief is not given in meaningful enough increments, it could convince the target of sanctions that there's no point in trying to negotiate, and it might prematurely close doors to negotiations that are starting to open. A further challenge lies in the fact that first, if sanctions are incrementally removed, it can undermine some of the secondary objectives of sanctions, some of the constraining elements. It can send unwanted signals. And sanctions also can't always easily be fine-tuned. The analogy of using a wrench and easily adjusting them aside. Private enterprises will conduct business based on their own assessments of risk, and if some sanctions are relieved while others remain in place, private businesses might not decide that conducting business in the sanctioned country is worth their time, and the amount of relief that the target of sanctions gets will be insufficient. On the other hand, if sanctions start to be relaxed, the target of sanctions might be able to start reconstituting some of their illicit trade networks that the sanctioner worked hard to dismantle, and sanctions relief could come too much too soon. And the challenge of getting sanctions relief right, this applies especially to financial sanctions because banks' anti-money laundering measures tend to be imposed very much on a risk basis, and it's hard to adjust that risk in accordance with adjusting sanctions. In general, commercial sanctions might be a little bit easier to turn on or off if there is the political will to do so. Sanctions on investment in a country are a little more difficult to just turn on or off. And finally, one last challenge comes from the coalition nature of sanctions, either being imposed through an international coalition or a domestic political coalition. Countries might agree at the outset of a sanctions incident of the need to impose sanctions, but have very different ideas about when sanctions should start to be lifted. This creates a very difficult coordination problem. And in the domestic realm, partisan conflict or tension between the executive and legislative branches might make lifting sanctions difficult, as I think we've seen with the JCPOA with Iran. And finally, in any sanctions regime that is comprehensive or near comprehensive, there are also important humanitarian considerations to keep in mind. Sanctions are intended, at least in part, to inflict pain on an adversary. That pain is often felt most acutely by the most vulnerable populations in a sanctioned country. And even though most sanctions regimes include humanitarian carve-outs, those carve-outs aren't always effective in practice. They require the sanctioning state to take a proactive role in ensuring that humanitarian items can get to recipients, but sanctioners will often be reluctant to do this because it could open up loopholes in the sanctions regime or otherwise show a lack of resolve. I would argue, though, that there is an important strategic reason as well as an ethical reason for minimizing the humanitarian impact of sanctions. If sanctions are seen as causing undue harm to a population, that could quickly erode international support for imposing those sanctions as well as support within the targeted country for those sanctions. So, quick background on history of the North Korea sanctions regime. For the first decade after North Korea's first nuclear test in 2006, UN sanctions were relatively narrow in scope, targeting North Korea's military and its core economy, as well as its facilitating interdictions of North Korean weapons at sea. U.S. efforts after the 2002 collapse of the agreed framework focused on targeting North Korea's illicit activities, its foreign arms sales, and the financial networks facilitating them. South Korea, after the end of the Sunshine Policy and the sinking of the Cheonan in 2010, cut off most avenues for inter-Korean cooperation with the so-called May 24th measures, but left in place for the time being the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which was by far the largest channel of inter-Korean economic cooperation and the most lucrative for Pyongyang. So the U.S. has engaged in partial sanctions relief during past rounds of talks with North Korea. The U.S. bilateral embargo on trade with North Korea was relaxed slightly during the 1990s as part of the agreed framework in the Perry process. As part of the six-party talks, the U.S. also relaxed some sanctions, financial sanctions that led to a freeze of $25 million in dirty North Korean money at Banco Delta Asia in 2007. The U.S. removed North Korea from trading with the Enemy Sanctions Act in 2008, and also removed North Korea from the state sponsor of terrorism list in 2008. These efforts, of course, ultimately failed to denuclearize North Korea. Why is that? I would argue that these measures, for the most part, served as confidence-building measures, and the value of sanctions relief during those negotiations was simply not commensurate with the goals that they aimed for. Furthermore, the sanctions that had the most impact on North Korea, the BDA sanctions, were poorly suited to be used as negotiating leverage, and the financial pressure that those sanctions put on North Korea starting around 2005 proved difficult to put back in place after the collapse of the six-party talks. Similarly, UN sanctions for the first decade after North Korea's first nuclear test proved to be ineffective. North Korea's foreign trade actually increased considerably during this period as a result of China's policy of deep engagement. The North Korean economy grew at a modest clip by all outside observations during this time. There was a steady flow of luxury goods into Pyongyang, as well as sensitive dual-use items such as CNC machines, which can be used to make centrifuges or rocket casings, as well as heavy-duty Chinese trucks that North Korea subsequently used as transport-director launchers for its ballistic missiles. So the North Korean fourth nuclear test in 2016 marked an important turning point. It led first to South Korea's shutdown of the Kaesong industrial complex, then to the U.S. Congress passing the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act, which is the first major piece of U.S. legislation specifically targeting North Korea with sanctions, and then the adoption, the UN, of Security Council Resolution 2270 shortly thereafter. This resolution marked an important conceptual turning point in the UN sanctions regime by targeting for the first time North Korea's commercial trade, specifically its coal exports. There wasn't an immediate impact from this resolution because of its livelihoods exemption that effectively allowed North Korea to keep exporting coal and other minerals unhindered. But the resolution did put in place the framework that is expanded upon by subsequent UN sanctions adopted in 2016 and 2017, which have effectively prohibited about 90% of North Korean exports by trade volume, prohibit major North Korean imports or restrict North Korean imports, including fuel, metals, machinery, and vehicles, put very strict financial sanctions on North Korea, restrict North Korean shipping, and require the repatriation of North Korean overseas laborers, among other aspects of the sanctions that exist at least on paper. The North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act, or NICSPIA, as amended by the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, passed by the U.S. Congress in 2017, and put into regulations with the revised North Korea sanctions regulations in early 2018, essentially tried to put teeth behind these sanctions through the threat of secondary sanctions enforcement. NICSPIA mandates that the executive branch of the U.S. Impose sanctions against both North Korean and third country entities that deal in North Korea's WMD program, that are involved in human rights violations, cybersecurity violations, illicit activities, etc. The executive branch also has discretionary authority to impose sanctions on most of North Korea's commercial trade, targeting again both North Korean entities and their foreign trading partners. NICSPIA, as amended, also blocks goods produced with North Korean labor, whether in North Korea or overseas, from entering the U.S. It blocks North Korea from the U.S. financial system and thereby from being able to conduct dollar-based transactions. And the legislation also led to a U.S. designation of North Korea as a primary money laundering concern, which requires U.S. banks to exercise enhanced due diligence to prevent direct or indirect North Korean access to the U.S. financial system. Also importantly, unlike the UN sanctions, which focus relatively narrowly on North Korean WMD activities as the grounds for their imposition, U.S. sanctions are imposed for multiple purposes, including not only North Korea's WMD programs, but also for human rights violations, illicit activities, etc. And while U.S. sanctions under NXPIA can be waived on a case-by-case basis to be suspended in block, the administration must submit a determination to Congress that North Korea has made, quote, progress, left undefined, on a variety of issues touching on human rights, illicit activities, and weapons of mass destruction. So since the beginning of its maximum pressure campaign in early 2017, the Trump administration has routinely issued new sanctions designations both on North Korean and third country entities, has pressured North Korean trade partners, especially those purchasing North Korean arms, such as Egypt and Sudan, and has sanctioned small banks based in Russia, China, and Latvia. However, the Trump administration has thus far avoided something that some sanctions advocates and members of Congress have called for, which is imposing sanctions on major Chinese financial institutions for facilitating North Korean access to the international financial system, helping North Korean money laundering. Presumably, the administration has declined to make those sanctions designations for fear of either setting off a financial crisis or weakening U.S.-China cooperation on North Korea or other issues. So, all in all, there's a lot of breadth and depth to the international sanctions regime targeting North Korea. And the question is, how best can we leverage all this pressure for concrete North Korean actions at the negotiating table? I think there are some clear first principles. First, there's a need for clear and consistent messaging about how sanctions will be enforced. Second, I think that quiet forms of sanctions enforcement are optimal. This could mean putting pressure on North Korea's trading partners, such as China, to do a better job of implementing sanctions. It could mean working with other third countries to improve their technical capabilities, to implement financial or shipping sanctions. These are things that the U.S. can do more or less behind closed doors that can have an impact. I think they're a good way to avoid the challenges that come with imposing sanctions and enforcing a sanctions regime while negotiations are underway. But these kind of quiet actions alone are not necessarily sufficient. Some new designations or civil lawsuits, other types of actions might still be necessary. And it's important that when these actions are undertaken, they're undertaken in a way that has relatively quiet messaging, that's not triumphalist in how they're messaged, that doesn't interfere too badly with the timing of diplomacy, and that all in all is kept on a separate track from negotiations. So in formulating policy, the U.S. also needs to address some of the coordination problems that have plagued past rounds of diplomacy with North Korea. The U.S. effectively has control over the relief of de jure UN sanctions. It has a seat on the P5. But the actual strength of UN sanctions depends to a very significant extent to how China and other countries are actually enforcing them. So China, Russia, and South Korea have all stated their support for an incremental program of sanctions relief. I think it's important for the U.S. to try to find common ground between their preference for such incremental sanctions relief and the U.S. preference for strong enforcement. I don't think these two objectives are necessarily misaligned. After all, the more strongly sanctions are enforced, the more impact that any one piece of sanctions concessions might have at the bargaining table. So, as a general principle, as the U.S. and North Korea engage in negotiations and potentially talk about partial sanctions relief, each step of a process should meaningfully advance the security interests of the U.S. and its allies. I would start small with confidence-building measures, delay major sanctions relief on commercial activities until North Korea started rolling back its nuclear program, and keep the broader framework of sanctions in place until North Korean denuclearization. It's also important that as sanctions begin to be suspended, there are credible threats of snapback if North Korea doesn't live up to its commitments. And in general, I think that that UN sanctions should generally be lifted first, and enforcement of U.S. secondary sanctions should be adjusted to change and reflect a changing UN sanctions regime. So starting with confidence building measures, I think there's a few small things that could be done right off the bat. There could be a whitelist facilitating the export of certain humanitarian goods to North Korea. Although UN and US sanctions permit the export of food and medicine to North Korea, in practice that hasn't been sufficient. The prohibitions on the export of metals, machinery, and vehicles to North Korea in particular has posed a major challenge for humanitarian agencies, since those categories of goods include things like agricultural equipment, some medical equipment, certain equipment for clean water. If the UN facilitated the easier export of those goods, I think that would really help as an initial confidence building measure, and also be good for humanitarian purposes. The US and South Korea could also facilitate certain types of cultural, educational, and other professional exchanges with North Korea that might require some sanctions to be suspended. Perhaps a little more ambitiously, could perhaps put in place some kind of pilot scale program allowing North Korea to export a limited quantity of sanctioned goods, put the income from those goods in an escrow account overseen by the UN, and allow the money in that account to be used for purchases of food, medicine, and other humanitarian items. I think North Korea, as I mentioned, might face significant food insecurity issues later this year, and putting in place a mechanism to try to creatively address that issue could be helpful. So in return for small confidence building measures from the US, there's a number of things North Korea could do as well. Have a written commitment to no nuclear missile tests, sign the CTBT, allow international inspectors to visit the nuclear testing site at Punggye-ri, which was blown up last year. Getting beyond that, though, I think the first set of major North Korean concessions on its nuclear program would likely relate to the Yongbyon nuclear facility, as that's what North Korea's already put on the table in past negotiations. Perhaps this first set of North Korean concessions could also include a freeze on North Korean ballistic missile production, and include some kind of roadmap agreement laying out future steps in a negotiating process. I would argue that in return for North Korean action on these measures, the first set of sanctions that could be suspended or removed would probably be sanctions related to non-sensitive North Korean imports on things like fuel, on metals, machinery, and vehicles that are not dual-use capable in any ways. I think these goods are important for North Korea. They're strategic inputs for the North Korean economy. But at the same time, focusing sanctions relief just on North Korean imports would not be fully satisfactory for North Korea, because if sanctions on exports and other hard currency earning activities remain in place, North Korea would still face the fundamental challenge of being able to purchase these imports. So I think there's a little bit of symmetry between that kind of sanctions relief and North Korean actions at Yongbyon. Something that's valuable, but not quite everything we need for something that North Koreans value, but isn't quite what they need either. And as part of this, set of initial steps, I think there could also be some facilitation of inter-Korean projects. I would start with the South Korean program to reconnect inter-Korean railways, modernize the North Korean road and rail system, resumption of tourism at Mount Kumgang. I would attach caveats, though, to a reopening of the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which I'll get to in a minute. So I think that relief of any sanctions which inhibit North Korea from earning hard currency in general should be tied to a verifiable halt in North Korea's production of fissile material or ballistic missiles. To do otherwise, as a senior State Department official put it after the Hanoi summit, would, quote, put us in the position of subsidizing the ongoing development of WMD in North Korea. So I think there's a basic bargain to be had here of UN sectoral sanctions being lifted or suspended in return for a verifiable end to North Korean fissile material production and ballistic missile production. This, of course, would require North Korea to own up to some of its undeclared uranium enrichment facilities and possibly other facilities as well. They so far have not proven willing to do that, but I think it's worth certainly testing at the negotiation table. So if we got this kind of interim agreement in place, I think it would do a great deal to stabilize the situation on the Korean Peninsula and provide the foundation for more comprehensive long-term settlement. If North Korea was not producing more fissile material or ballistic missiles, it would, I think, dramatically reduce the prospects of conflict. It would reduce the chances of horizontal North Korean proliferation to other countries, and it would inhibit the kind of rapid changes in the regional balance of power on the Korean Peninsula that tend to spark conflicts. So if you have such a interim agreement in place, I think that there are different kinds of snapback mechanisms that you could attach to it. You could either incorporate something similar to that snapback mechanism established under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran and Resolution 2231, where essentially any P5 member can declare that North Korea is in violation of its agreements and thereby reinstate sanctions based on only one P5 member's vote. Alternatively, you could do something like suspending sectoral sanctions for a 90-day or 180-day period and renew that suspension periodically so long as North Korea is kept up with its commitments. Potentially, some sanctions that are suspended could be lifted once North Korea has verifiably dismantled rather than only frozen activities at some of these facilities. However, with this kind of interim agreement, I'd argue that it would be important to keep other aspects of the sanctions regime in place, especially financial sanctions, which would continue to be important. That leads to the question of, how exactly would North Korean commercial trade work if financial sanctions are still in place. And I think expanding a UN-overseen escrow system of some sort, allowing some UN oversight of North Korean commercial imports and exports and financing might be the answer. I think North Korea almost certainly wouldn't like this kind of setup, but if the alternatives were North Korea having to rely on barter trade along its border or using illicit bank accounts subject to a potential freeze, I think this might be an option that Pyongyang could grudgingly accept. So how do we get beyond this kind of interim agreement, given the very justifiable skepticism about whether North Korea will ever give up the entirety of its nuclear program? I would start from the premise that if North Korea is going to make the strategic choice to disarm, it'll do so as part of a much broader strategic shift in both its foreign relations and domestic policies. If Kim Jong-un is serious about delivering on the promise of North Korean people enjoying a, quote, affluent and highly civilized life, there will need to be at least some measure of greater openness in North Korea, greater economic transparency, and at least marginal improvements in the country's human rights record. Therefore, sanctions relief after an interim agreement is in place should be tied to greater openness and greater economic transparency in North Korea. Sanctions relief with an interim agreement in place could proceed in conjunction with a U.S. or multilateral dialogue with North Korea on a broad range of issues, everything from human rights to regional economic integration, biological and chemical weapons, cybersecurity, peace regime. And sanctions relief at this stage could be tied to credible North Korean commitments to engage economically on a different standard than it has previously. The Kaesong Industrial Complex, for example, could be reopened if North Korea made a credible commitment to have the workers there receive their wages directly and be able to keep their wages, rather than the North Korean regime essentially receiving those wages on the workers' behalf. Ideally, South Korean companies at Kaesong would also be able to, managers would be able to interact more freely with employees. South Korean companies could build more linkages between Kaesong and the rest of the North Korean economy. They're sourcing inputs from North Korea's economy, or selling some of the goods made at Kaesong within North Korea. Similarly, a resumption of North Korea's export of overseas workers could be tied to a credible North Korean commitment to have those workers work under conditions that meet basic international labor organization standards, the most important of which I think is allowing them to receive their wages and keep their wages directly. Approval of new investment at this stage in North Korea could be approved by the UN Sanctions Committee on a case-by-case basis if those investments meet certain criteria, specifically related to improving the public welfare in a meaningful way in North Korea, and as long as those investments are in non-sensitive areas. I think at this stage you could also suspend some U.S. sanctions if North Korea begins to make credible improvements to its human rights record, both related to labor rights and to conditions in the prison system. And then even further down the road, full declaration and dismantlement of all remaining aspects of North Korea's WMD program should be tied to the lifting of all UN and probably most US sanctions, as well as steps to integrate North Korea into the international economy. This is undoubtedly a long ways off, but if a partial sanctions relief process moves forward, it'll be important not to let this ultimate objective fall by the wayside. So, President Moon Jae-in will be in Washington tomorrow, as Kyle mentioned, and most likely he'll appeal to President Trump for greater U.S. willingness to accept a step-by-step approach to denuclearization and a greater willingness to engage in incremental sanctions relief. I hope that his visit will provide the opportunity to develop something closer to a shared U.S.-South Korea approach on this issue, and to provide the jolt of energy that might be necessary to restart meaningful and ongoing working-level negotiations between the U.S. and North Korea. Incremental sanctions relief, as part of a comprehensive strategy toward North Korea, doesn't have to mean providing unilateral concessions and relieving economic pressure without reciprocity. Rather, I would argue that it provides the most realistic means by which to remove and reduce the threat of the North Korean nuclear program. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. It was a very good overview of your paper, which really took a good look at applying theory to the North Korean case right now. And I really like how you outlined all the potential steps. It adds a degree of clarity to the argument. So I'm going to turn things over now to Bill to see how he offers some of his thoughts in the paper.
Okay, thanks for having me here. It's so much fun to be able to comment on a paper and not have to write it. And I'll congratulate Dan for an excellent paper, and they got it well in time. I got a week ago, or at least, so I've had plenty of time to review it. Although I must admit I stayed up too late watching that UVA game last night, so I might be a little incoherent. A very nice paper, and a very, I think, useful in the long term. We can put it on a bookshelf to sort of keep remembering what the sanctions history has been and how it's been progressing. This idea of, oh, and I love the title, maximum pressure, maximum leveraged. You might add your thought, well-placed pressure and well-placed leverage. I think that's real important. The idea of sanctions has always bothered me. I mean, the term sanctions has always bothered me. Do y'all know the word contronym? Anybody define contronym? I know it because it's also part of my name, Bill. Bill is a contronym. A bill, I have a $10 bill, I have some money, or I have a bill that I have to pay some money. So is a bill good or not? Is a sanction good or not? It's actually a contronym. There are very few words in English that are contronyms, but it's the opposite of itself. Sanction can mean you want to do it, you're allowed to do it, actually allowed to do it, or you're not allowed to do it. The USTA sanctioned tennis tournament, yes. UN sanctions on North Korea, don't do it. Anyway, the word, and as you can see, I've been tortured over this issue for, at least a decade, going back and forth looking at North Korea sanctions. It's a very difficult business. Incorporates a lot of different academic disciplines. A key one here that we're focused on now is the business aspect of it, the negotiation aspect of a sanction. Tit for tat, how are you going to manipulate sanctions to get a given end? That's really business more than anything. But of course there's national security aspect to it. WMD deterrence, mindlessly complicated psychological issues there. And then of course my discipline of economics. Within that discipline, I think sanctions best come under a subdiscipline called game theory. So it's a great use of game theory to apply. It's great to use game theory to apply this kind of problem. People do that a lot. Even KEI does that with its education activities out in the real world. I'm not thinking the role-playing kind of UN model UN kind of game playing, though. I'm thinking of a more strategic, careful assessment. Game theory comes in basically where competitive economics falls apart. Competitive means many, many players. Nobody has a corner on the market, or it can even affect a price. Many issues in economics are not that way. There are very few players, and so you have to apply game theory. And I think in this case, game theory works very helpfully, and I'll just add a few ideas to your paper on that. Mostly, though, on your paper, I agree quite completely. The idea of using sanctions as a tool, certainly. You don't just put them on and leave them there forever. That's kind of the way we end up doing them, but I've always thought we should manipulate them. Actually, you get probably more leverage from being able to take off a sanction than for imposing it. So I want to talk about that just a little bit. And certainly right now, this should be the top of our agenda, looking at how we take off sanctions. I'm thinking the sanctions regime now is incredibly comprehensive, what you said in your paper, yes. We don't need to be adding sanctions, I don't think. We need to be enforcing them, certainly, but not adding to them. We need to keep everybody on board on this process. That's kind of, you can think of as a six-party kind of group, or two-party, three-party, but it's kind of, again, fits into game theory. Kind of for a point of discussion, so we can have a good discussion. We have plenty of time here, I think. I'm thinking the paper is a little bit, the scope of the paper is a little bit narrow for the reach of its, of the program you want to move toward. And, I think we need more things in the paper, and maybe I can add to that a little bit. The maximum, to me, I think you say this as well, it's really the maximum pressure that brought North Korea to the table. The maximum pressure of 2017, which was much more than sanctions. That was military, political, all that harangue going back and forth, the big button, the little button, all that hostility on both sides really sort of forced the two sides to come to the table. I think U.S. leverage in this, maximizing U.S. leverage, still involves being able to go back to that. In our back pocket, we can still move back to maximum pressure. Kim, I think, knows that. At the same time, Kim has in his back pocket the leverage of moving back toward doing nuclear tests, ICBM tests. So both of us still have in our back pocket leverage points. I'm really happy right now that I don't think either is likely. I think we are in a very nice period where the likelihood of a North Korean provocation is very low, and I think the idea that we would move back to maximum military pressure is very low right now. So I'm actually very optimistic that we're proceeding in a good path here. So I like to say I'm thinking time really is on our side. A lot of people might disagree. It really comes down to what do I mean by our. So here's where, let me give you an application of game theory. How do we define our? It's hugely important. If you're going to play a game, what's the most important thing you need to know first off? Anybody idea? It's not the rules of the game, it's not the goals of the game, it's the number of players in the game, all right? They're different kind of games. There's a one-person game. Golf is kind of a one-person game. You're playing against yourself. I love to play singles tennis. That's a two-party game. Me versus him. I win, you lose, I win. Definition of a two-party game is zero-sum. Sounds nasty, right? But we all play. We love two-party games. So how do we apply a two-party game? How do we look at this North Korea sanctions game? I'm thinking we've been looking at it too few parties. I want to introduce some more parties to the game. I think that will make it a more fun game, doubles tennis. It will also scramble up everything so that you can avoid this zero-sum kind of construct. How would you do that? Well, importantly to me is to look at the North Korea. North Korea is not a monolithic entity. We always say North Korea. Will North Korea give its nuclear weapon? That's kind of a silly question, actually. Of course, nobody gives up a nuclear weapon. But let's look at North Korea more carefully. Now, there are millions of players there, so who are you going to pick? We don't know much about it. I would say let's simplify to two different actors in North Korea, the state actor and the private actor. That every North Korean has a state side and a private side. Let's drive a wedge between that. Our big trouble with North Korea is really that state. North Korea is the most state-centric country in the world by far. That's why it can't get along with anybody else. That's why it needs nuclear weapons to protect itself. So if we can drive that wedge, help the private side, hurt the state side, we're well on our way, I think, to solving this problem. So that's probably my main recommendation is that we work to split the North Korean state from the private side. Now, looking at Dan's recommendations, that's where I think you bring in another topic like the North Korean state and North Korean private. You start looking at all those things differently. Some of them I like a lot, the idea of confidence building measures. I think actually we're doing that. I think we're doing quite a lot. You don't mention, for example, the North Korean side, they're not doing anti-U.S. propaganda. That is a huge confidence building measure. For me, it makes me feel much better about North Korea in the last year. They haven't been blasting the U.S. at every point. Same time, we're not doing our exercises. The symmetry, Trump is saying funny but kind of nice things about Kim. All that, I think, is doing the same thing in North Korea. It's confidence building. I think we're doing that quite well and on a good track on that. I would say no aid to North Korea. This is where you're from basically an aid group. I know a lot of times you need to give aid, but to me, North Korea is a catastrophe because it's gotten way too much aid over its 30 years. It doesn't know how to export anymore because it's gotten too much aid. So idea of food aid to North Korea? No, not a pound of food aid until they decollectivize. The problem in North Korean agriculture is obvious to all. It's the collective farming system that's failed everywhere in the world. They've still got it. Some people are arguing they're breaking away from it. Okay, great, but prove to me that they're breaking away from collective farms, and I can be much more tolerant. Otherwise, no food aid. No investment. No, I'm not keen on investment in North Korea. I don't even think that, I think my guess is they're afraid of investment. This is the kind of thing we're offering as an inducement, that Trump's movie and all that. If I were the North Korean, a lot of the North Korean state, I would be afraid to death of all that. Now, the private side might like it, but the state side, no, we don't want Samsung in here. No, we want to shield ourselves from that system. So move ahead with confidence building. Overall policy, I think we should be looking at reducing sanctions. But a key thing fitting that game theory to the policy would mean as you reduce your sanctions on North Korean exports, put in new requirements. All North Korean exports need to be WTO compliant. They need to pay workers directly. They need to act like a market. That's good for them. That's good for us. It's key for China. China can't have North Korea dumping textiles into there. There's no mystery to me that China's on board with this, with our saying they're as much in favor of it as we are. So they're not doing us a favor. We're in effect doing them a favor. So let's adjust our policies. Let's look at that state, non-state actors in North Korea and see how we can push one side and the other. And I think if we do it correctly, we can end up in a much better environment here. That's all I want to say right now, but we have plenty of time, I think.
Thanks so much, Bill and Dan. If you want to take some time to respond, also, if you want to touch upon some of the things that we had to cut from your paper for space constraints. I know you said there was more that you would like to see added. I know there were some examples that weren't able to make it in. If you want to bring those up in your response to some of Bill's points too.
Sure. So just respond to a couple of Bill's points. I think that maximum pressure, both sanctions and military threats. I do think that's part of what got North Korea to the table. I don't think it's the entirety. I think that South Korean outreach also played a role. I think the fact that North Korea might have made as much progress as it wanted to make at the time on advancing its nuclear and ballistic missile program at the time played a role. But yeah, I think both sides certainly have an incentive not to go back to the dynamics that were in place in 2017. And I think North Korea basically paused its ICBM testing right around the point where they had a somewhat credible ICBM capability, but not a fully realized one yet. They didn't have that didn't demonstrate that they had a reentry vehicle that could be reliable. Didn't do a full-length test, thankfully, of their ICBMs. If they go back to that, I think that could be very dangerous. It's very good that they've paused where they did. On the point on no aid to North Korea, I would just say I think it is important to give emergency humanitarian assistance that's targeted towards populations that are most vulnerable and in many cases don't necessarily have access to markets, especially things like school children, people, pregnant and lactating mothers, other more vulnerable populations. But yeah, I think aid, just giving very large amounts of unmonitored food aid or fertilizer aid or energy assistance isn't necessarily the right approach. I think actually sanctions relief in some ways is a good way to go about things as opposed to just an incentive-based negotiating program, because as sanctions are relieved, that might, in some ways help with marketization, or at least not hinder marketization in the way that some large inducement packages have in the past. A few examples on sanctions relief. I in the first draft of the paper had a few examples of where sanctions relief had gone wrong or gone right in other negotiations. I don't think there's any really great examples, unfortunately, of sanctions relief done right. Maybe that goes to show how difficult it is to get it right. But Iran, I think, is a good example, provides a lot of good examples of technical aspects to incorporate into a sanctions relief regime, both things like the UN snapback mechanism that was put in place with Iran sanctions relief and the JCPOA, the structure of having an interim agreement that showed that you can start to relieve some sanctions and then still get to a broader agreement after that. I think the negative example set by Iran is that sanctions relief, at least as provided by the U.S., is not necessarily reliable because after the Obama administration negotiated the JCPOA, the Trump administration didn't like it and it's reimposed the sanctions. And I think that's sends an unfortunate message to North Korea and other countries that would like to negotiate their way out of U.S. sanctions. Similarly, Libya, not a great example if you look at what happened to Gaddafi 8 years after giving up his nuclear program. I would make the point that even if you set aside the end of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, the Libya model of sanctions relief is perhaps a little more nuanced than some advocates of it might have people believe. This wasn't necessarily a decision out of the blue on the part of Gaddafi made in 2003 to give up all of his WMD programs because the U.S. had been unrelentingly tough in applying sanctions pressure. There had been several years lead up to that decision in 2003. During the 1990s, Libya started to comply with the demands affiliated with UN sanctions on Libya to repatriate the Lockerbie bombers, and UN sanctions were subsequently suspended. In 1999, Libya started what proved to be abortive talks with the U.S. over abandoning its chemical weapons program. Of course, in 2003, the overall strategic situation for Libya and for Gaddafi was very different. That led to a decision ultimately to abandon not just a chemical weapons program, but a nascent nuclear program. I think that the whole structure of sanctions relief negotiations goes to show that you can start with a diplomatic process that's perhaps uneven at first, that doesn't make straightforward progress. It's unclear if the adversary that's trying to get sanctions lifted is necessarily serious about their commitments. But if you put that process in place, and if the right external factors start to line up, that could lead to that country making a strategic choice down the road to change direction.
Thank you so much for those comments. I'm cognizant we don't have too much time left, about 20 minutes, so I'm just going to turn over my moderator's prerogative to ask questions, to turn it over to the audience. And I would just ask, before you ask any of your questions, I would, if you could please state your name and your affiliation. We'll have 2 mics running around the room. We'll go to the back. Yes, Scott?
Hi, Scott Seaman with Eurasia Group. To your knowledge, have the North Koreans ever provided a list of how they would rank sanctions, which ones they would want removed first, as a way to kind of facilitate that type of incremental give and take on both sides. I don't know if they've done that. They kind of talk about wanting everything removed, but I don't know if they've given kind of a more nuanced view.
Yeah, at Hanoi, they did articulate which specific sanctions they wanted removed. They wanted the last 5 UN sanctions resolutions lifted. And when the North Korean foreign minister gave a press conference after the summit ended, he specifically said that, these are the demands we asked for. He referenced the removal of the sanctions that affected people's livelihoods in North Korea and commercial activities. So a little unclear whether he was, talking just about the sectoral sanctions on North Korean commercial trade in those resolutions, or the whole thing, which includes financial and shipping sanctions, etc. More generally, it's unclear to me whether the North Korean offer on hand in Hanoi, if that represented essentially an opening bid that the North Koreans would have expected to be negotiated down, or if that was the final offer on hand. And I think that's certainly worth trying to suss out as negotiations move forward. I think in general, though, yeah, it's very noteworthy that the North Koreans are actually identifying specific sanctions that they want lifted. They are referring in some cases, as Hugh Griffiths of the UN panel of experts recently pointed out, to specific statutory language in the sanctions to justify why they should be lifted. So, in some ways, I think that's progress, and that actually sets the boundaries for a more reasonable negotiating process, rather than the North Koreans talking about sanctions in the abstract.
Hi, Alicia Sanders-Zachary, Arms Control Association. One thing that I didn't see mentioned as much in your report is kind of the role of Congress in lifting sanctions. Recently, we haven't seen much of an appetite among the U.S. Congress for lifting sanctions on North Korea, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role that Congress could play in the future to progress or impede sanctions lifting on North Korea.
Yeah, so under NXPIA, as the report mentions, Congress basically laid out a pretty high series of steps North Korea has to undertake to have U.S. sanctions suspended. Under the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, Congress actually added more requirements to lifting sanctions on North Korea. Essentially, if any sanctions are lifted, the Secretary of State has to explain why they were lifted to Congress and justify that removal. And the general trend, you're certainly correct, the general trend is that, Congress is playing a more active role in oversight of sanctions and sanctions relief, and in many cases, making it more difficult for the executive branch to relieve sanctions unilaterally. And I think that was definitely the case with COTSA, with the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, in regard to Russia sanctions. I think there was some logic behind wanting a lot of congressional oversight on those, but I think the broader trend of kind of tying the executive branch's hands on the pace of timing of sanctions relief is not a very helpful trend in terms of getting the U.S. to have maximum flexibility in negotiations.
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's kind of what I mean by broadening the scope and increasing the number of players. Obviously, Congress plays a huge role in this. Not just Congress, a lot of different players, but Congress, that's just where I think the agreed framework fell on its face. They didn't get buy-in from the Congress, or the Congress changed in the meantime and made it difficult. But without that buy-in, I think looking at the U.S. sanctions, for example, the U.S. sanctions really, I've never thought of are very effective at all. I like the sanctions environment now only because China has stepped on the board. U.S. sanctions are not really sanctions. U.S. has huge impediments to trade with North Korea since the Korean War. That's what Congress needs to be looking at. I'm not adverse to them because North Korea is still not in the WTO. It's not compliant with the market economy. But if North Korea should make movement in that direction toward creating a market economy like China, like Russia, like all the Eastern European states, Congress should be looking at how can we take North Korea off that incredibly high tariff, column B, I think it is, where for North Korea to export to the U.S., they pay on textiles something like 80% tariffs. They're the only country in the world that has to do that. Why? Because they're not in the WTO. It has nothing to do with these nuclear sanctions. So there's a whole host of issues going back to the Korean War that Congress should be looking at and seeing how can these be manipulated, changed, the TWIA Act, for example, Trade with the Enemy Act, terrorist list, things like that, whole host of things that I think could be adding to the package of tools that Trump could be taking to the next summit. That sort of could be offering, look, my guess, and going back to your question on the list of sanctions, my guess is even at the Hanoi summit, Kim will look at that list of what we're offering and say, you know, this doesn't really do me any good. I think he's under acute pressure right now, monetary pressure inside North Korea. And, you know, a few tourists, Kumgangsan, it's not going to help him out. So, I mean, I'm thinking a concerted effort on our side, including, I think, especially Congress, to look and see what could be done to induce North Korea to move toward a market economy, to reform itself. That could be hugely helpful, I think.
Thank you. Alana Hartsock, Earth Rights Institute. This may relate to what William Brown has just stated. How and why has a small country like North Korea become a pawn in the geopolitical power struggle between those who seek to maintain a unipolar world versus those who seek a multipolar world?
I'm not sure what you mean by pawn. It is a pawn. I mean, it's a small country. A pawn is a small pawn. I like to play chess. Pawns are often the key players. That's how you really trap a king. So it's not like a pawn is insignificant, but it is small. North Korea is small. And it's always been a difficult case. I'm thinking, though, it's difficult because the world has made it difficult. I think I'm sympathetic to North Koreans, definitely. A little bit even to the regime, because they've inherited this incredibly bad system from Stalin. That's where he got it from. Everybody's been afraid of it ever since, and so they've protected it, allowed this system to keep going. It's kind of a cancer. It keeps growing, without willing to change it. So I'm all in favor of movement toward changing North Korea, not the regime, changing the system of North Korea. I don't know if that helps your, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Ji-Young Seo. I'm a TV reporter at KBS. I'd like to ask to you, Daniel, thank you for your presentation, and I like the technical framework. But the thing is that I think the problem is that the fundamental trust building between two countries. So for the North Korean, they may raise the question, how can we trust the United States if Democrats take over the White House? And then after that, can we trust? And also the United States will raise a question, even though there's a tough sanction, United resolution, but North Korea always trying to find the way around illegal smuggling or whatever. So how can we trust the build between two countries? And do you think a snapback mechanism is enough?
Thank you. I'm Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. Anyway, there was a study done of 100 cases of sanctions, and they failed 86 times, and they're often a prelude to war. So I think that they're a tool used in a certain way. And yeah, you mentioned, having some sympathy or understanding of the North Koreans, and that I think maybe in a game it's important to have empathy or consciousness of the perspective of your opponent. And so behind them, there's also like a huge amount of trauma, devastation, and people are more dangerous when they're frightened, humiliated, isolated, and back to a corner. So I think actually we're safer now because Trump actually gave Kim Jong-un some dignity, and now he's out talking, meeting with leaders around the world and traveling and going to China. So I think we're actually safer now. He's less of a threat now because he's not so much of a pariah and humiliated, and he has some more dignity. So, sanction. There's also sort of an egocentrism on our part to like we're coercing them. So what about more positive inducements or opening up, reducing tension, conflict transformation, some things that are more outside the box?
Yeah, so I'll actually try to combine, those two questions a little bit because I think they both touch on trust between the two parties and how do you build trust. I had the chart with, steps that the U.S. can take or UN can take on sanctions on the one hand, and steps that North Korea can take on its nuclear program on the other. I think, if we're building out a more full-fledged, robust negotiating framework, I think there should also be, a third column there on trust and confidence building measures, which I think would have to proceed in tandem with this kind of framework. And that's everything from diplomacy and exchanges and summitry to a peace declaration and talks leading to a peace treaty to military confidence building measures, etc. I think how those measures interact with the rest of the framework is a complicated question, but obviously they have to be incorporated as well. I think this is not just about trading off in a very narrow sense sanctions for nuclear concessions, but also about fundamentally changing the U.S.-North Korea relationship and changing North Korea's relationship with the rest of the world. I do think that if you have sanctions relief, nuclear concessions, confidence building measures in a kind of step-by-step framework, I think that will help to deal with some of the trust deficit that's in place and that's certainly there on both sides. And then the question of North Korea trying to evade sanctions, I think it's inevitable that North Korea will continue to do what it's very good at, which is to find creative new ways to get around sanctions. And that's why I'd argue put North Korean sanctions evasion and U.S. and international sanctions enforcement on a separate track from the rest of negotiations. Assume that North Korea is going to try to keep evading sanctions, and they should assume that the sanctions in place will be enforced if they try to evade that. With the caveat, though, that if there's either North Korean sanctions evasion or U.S.-led sanctions enforcement that is kind of outside the tacit framework that we're currently operating in. That is to say, if the U.S. decides to significantly expand the sanctions regime while talks are underway, or if North Korea does something really nasty like exporting fissile material to another country for cash, then obviously that's going to affect the broader tenor of negotiations.
Yeah, on the, I think up until about 3 years ago, I was very negative on the sanctions on North Korea. I did not think they were working. So reading all these studies of, what did you say, 86 failed or something out of 100. Caution you on the data a little bit. Of course, before you go to war, it would be natural you do sanctions first. So it doesn't mean the sanctions caused the war. It means the sanctions were a predecessor to some kind of hostility. In North Korea's case, I I mean, these the sanctions are kind of added on to this history of bad relations with America. It goes back to the Korean War and to Marxism, to Stalin. So I think it's important not to put too much importance just on the sanctions. It's this whole environment that really needs to be fixed. That's why I like to look at these negotiations, not just in terms of sanctions, but kind of like, and the Intelligence Committee said something, North Korea will never give up their nukes or something. I think that's kind of inane statement. Of course, nobody ever gives up their nukes. But it's also kind of perverse because it sort of predicts what we're going to offer for them. I mean, it's a game. It's negotiating. What will we give up? What will they give up? Clearly at Hanoi, the two sides didn't come to an agreement. It's kind of like you have your house for sale. Well, is your house listed yet? No, but it's kind of have a sign, we're thinking about it. So Kim is thinking about it. And Trump goes there, well, we want to buy your house. And Trump and Kim, well, you're not offering enough. And they don't make a deal. So the solution to that may be offering more, but it may be broadening the scope of the deal. Adding some warranties, we do this in business all the time. Adding things, you get buying a car and your wife doesn't like the car, you want the car, so you made some kind of deal, right? Non-monetary deal. This is kind of what I'm thinking needs to happen here, is that we need to broaden the scope of the negotiations to add some more deals. I'm thinking that, again, when Kim looks at that list at Hanoi of what we're giving him, he's thinking, this is not going to solve my problem. My problem is money. They're not giving me any money. They don't want to give me any money. So how do you go about that? I think his main problem, we say he wants security. Of course, everybody wants security. Is his big problem U.S. attacking him? I don't think so. I don't even think he thinks so. His big problem is internal. People rising up in the streets like they did all over Eastern Europe. That could happen in North Korea. We don't know that it won't. So I'm sure that's his big worry. People rising up against him, somebody killing him. That to me, so if we can sort of help defray that kind of worry for him, will help you reform, then you won't need nuclear weapons. You can become a normal country. I get a sense from Kim, unlike his father and grandfather, that he really does want North to become a more normal country. That's my sense. I might be wrong. I think that would be hugely beneficial for North Korea. It would be beneficial for everybody. So my thinking is these negotiations, we're in a great spot. We've got these sanctions. Unlike many sanctions in the past, other countries, we've got a huge coalition. Everybody in the world is on our side on this thing. The UN, we complain about China and Russia. They're on board. They signed those sanctions. Everybody, just about everybody in the world is on board with sanctioning North Korea. So it's a huge, comprehensive deal impacting North Korea. This is what makes me optimistic.
We have time for one last round of questions. Okay, so we'll just take one then. Yes, right here in the front.
Yeah, Ken Meyercord, retiree. Could South Korea sign a peace treaty with North Korea independent of us?
That's an interesting question. I guess, if North Korea and South Korea signed a treaty, nothing's necessarily stopping them from doing that. But the armistice agreement was actually signed not by South Korea, but by the United Nations Command, as led by the United States, by the North Korean People's Army, and by the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, which no longer exists, but is front for the Chinese military. South Korea was kind of represented under the armistice agreement as one of the 16 UN command states, but they didn't sign the armistice directly. If there was a peace agreement between the two Koreas, it would have to address the armistice agreement in some manner, and I think it would be difficult to have that kind of bilateral agreement in place without addressing the armistice. I mean, there have been major inter-Korean agreements in the past that have tried to set the foundation for a normalized inter-Korean relationship, such as the 1992 Inter-Korean Basic Agreement, which was, I think, very important and had a lot of important provisions, but then kind of fell by the wayside very quickly. So I think that for a more lasting peace deal, it would probably have to involve not just the two Koreas, but also the U.S. and China.
I just to add there's another problem with the Korean Constitution. The Republic of Korea claims all of Korea. The DPRK claims all of Korea. So their own constitutions don't at all tolerate some kind of peace treaty. They want the other side. Now, in reality, I think they're both, at least the South Korean side is coming to the idea that of a separate North Korea first. But not all Koreans are that way. Maybe 60%, maybe 40%, I don't know. A lot of Koreans still want North Korea as part of them first. Everybody eventually wants it to be united, but it's sort of the stepwise path that's incredibly difficult using their own South Korean rules, constitution to get that way. In that way, I'm not sure they can really sign a peace treaty, but I'm not sure that a peace treaty is worth a piece of paper, to tell you the truth. So anyway.
Well, that's all the time we have. We'll look forward to seeing what happens tomorrow with Moon and Trump and moving forward, and how, Dan, your outline sort of does or doesn't become adopted. It's very, very different from what's going on right now, but I think that there are some key lessons to be taken away from your paper and your talk. So thank you all for your questions, and please join me in thanking both Dan and Bill for being here today.